The Gunner Who Defied Command: How a 22-year-old tail gunner revolutionized the B-17's defense. October 14, 1943, 25,000 feet above Germany. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano crammed into the claustrophobic tail turret of a B-17G Flying Fortress grips the twin spade handles of his M2.50 caliber machine guns. Each weapon, fed by belts of heavy ammunition, weighs more than he does. The air is thin and bitterly cooled, the deafening roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines a constant vibration in his bones. Through the scarred, frost-rimmed plexiglass of his tiny window, he spots the sleek, deadly shape of a Focke-Wulf FW-190 rolling into position. It's coming from 6 o'clock low, directly behind and below the bomber, the most vulnerable blind spot, the angle every German pilot has been trained to exploit. Romano's heart hammers against his ribs. He presses his face against the frozen metal of his gun sight, a crude ring and bead system, essentially a metal circle at the rear and a post at the front, identical to the iron sights on a musket. To hit his target, he must perform an impossible mental calculus, estimate the FW-190 speed over 350 miles per hour, factor in his own bomber's speed, 280 miles per hour, calculate the bullet's drop over hundreds of yards, and guess the precise deflection, the point in empty sky where his bullets and the fighter will meet, all while oxygen-starved, wearing bulky, electrically heated gloves, and with cannon shells about to tear his plane apart. He squeezes the triggers. The guns roar, shaking the entire turret. Tracer rounds, 1 in every 5 bullets, streak out in a deceptively slow-looking arc. He watches them pass harmlessly behind the diving FW-190. A second later, the Germans' wings flash with light. 20-millimeter cannon shells, each the size of a small banana, rip through the bomber's aluminum skin like it was tissue paper. The sound is a horrific brrr, thud, thud, thud of impacting high explosives. Someone screams over the interphone. This scene was not unique. It repeated itself 291 times that day across the second raid on Schweinfurt. The 8th Air Force had dispatched 291 B-17s deep into the heart of Germany, believing their tight formations and heavy armament would be defense enough. They were wrong. By nightfall, 60 of those fortresses, over 20% of the force, were spiraling wrecks in German fields. Another 138 limped back to England so catastrophically damaged they would never fly again. 600 American airmen were dead, missing, or captured in a single day. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. A bomber crew was required to fly 25 missions before being rotated home. At the October 1943 loss rate, a crew's statistical life expectancy was barely 11 missions. The Flying Fortress, the battleship of the sky, was failing catastrophically. Post-mission autopsies revealed a grim, specific truth. The tail gunner's position, the bomber's last line of defense against the most common attack, was almost useless. Gunners were achieving hit rates below 8%. German pilots quickly learned they could approach from the rear, endure a few seconds of wildly inaccurate fire, and methodically dismantle the American bombing campaign, one fortress at a time. Senior commanders gathered in the war rooms at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, facing a strategic crisis. Daylight precision bombing, the core doctrine of the USAAF, was on the verge of collapse. Without a solution, the entire campaign might be scrapped. What these worried generals did not know was that at that very moment, on a windswept hardstand at Bassingbourn Airfield, a 22-year-old tail gunner from Pittsburgh, a man with barely a high school education and no engineering training, was sketching a design in his grease-stained logbook. It was a design that violated a dozen Army Air Forces regulations, a design that weapons engineers at Wright Field would call mechanically impossible. a design that would, against all odds, triple tailgun accuracy and save thousands of American lives. This is the story of the innovation they tried to ban and the sergeant who refused to stop. The impossible problem, the coffin at the tail. To understand why Staff Sergeant Michael Romano's idea was so revolutionary, one must first understand the sheer, terrifying impossibility of his job. The B-17's defense philosophy was borrowed from the Navy. A flying fortress would be a bristling porcupine of 50 caliber guns, creating overlapping fields of fire to shred any attacker. The tailgun position was the linchpin of this plan, meant to defend the bomber's most exposed flank. Reality was a cruel parody. The tail turret was a tiny, unpowered, unheated hell. Measuring roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, it was barely larger than a coffin. Romano did not sit. He knelt on a hard, bicycle-style seat, his boots braced against the aircraft's cold frame. The 2 Browning M2s were mounted on a simple yoke that he had to muscle around by hand, fighting not just their 84-pound weight, but also the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream screaming past the open window slits. His sole aiming tool was the AN-1 ring and bead sight. It offered no magnification, no illumination, and no computational aid. Using it to hit a fast-moving fighter was like shooting a speeding bullet with a slingshot by looking through 2 soda straws. Gunners were taught to estimate using complex memory-based lead tables, but in combat, with fear, cold, and hypoxia clouding the mind, these were useless. The Luftwaffe's tactics evolved with predatory efficiency. By late 1943, their standard attack was the Schräge Musik-inspired rear approach. Come in from directly behind, 6 o'clock level, or slightly below, 6 o'clock low, where the tailguns had the narrowest field of fire. A pilot would hold his dive for 20 to 25 seconds, a lifetime in aerial combat, knowing the return fire would be inaccurate. At 200 to 300 yards, he would open up with his 20mm cannons, whose explosive shells could disintegrate a bomber in a few hits. Luftwaffe after-action reports coldly noted that B-17 tailgunners posed a negligible deterrent. The proof was in the staggering losses. August 17, 1943, first Schweinfurt raid, 60 B-17s lost. October 8, 1943, Bremen raid, 30 B-17s lost. October 10, 1943, Münster raid, 30 B-17s lost. The 8th Air Force was bleeding out. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the USAAF, reviewed the casualty lists and secretly questioned whether daylight bombing could continue. Engineers at Boeing scrambled, designing a new powered tail turret with better sights, but it was a factory-level modification. It would take months to reach the front lines and required cutting off and replacing the entire tail section of existing bombers, an impossibility for bombers already in combat theaters. Meanwhile, men like Michael Romano were sent to die with obsolete tools. The unlikely innovator, a factory worker in a flying coffin. Michael Romano was an unlikely candidate to solve one of the Air Force's most critical technical problems. Born in 1924 to immigrant parents in Pittsburgh, he dropped out of high school at 16 to work in the steel mills when his father fell ill. He learned practical mechanics not from textbooks, but from keeping blast furnaces and heavy machinery running through sheer grit and intuition. He enlisted in 1942, seeking something beyond the soot and heat of the mill. The Army, noting his small, wiry frame, 5'7", 140 pounds, assigned him to be a tail gunner. He could fit in the tight space. His training at Harlingen Gunnery School in Texas was unremarkable. He scored average on the ranges. His instructors noted he was competent, disciplined, but showed no flashes of brilliance. He was, in the vast machinery of war, an interchangeable part. But Romano possessed a trait that didn't appear on his service record, a blue-collar craftsman's refusal to accept broken tools. After his fifth mission on October 4, 1943, his bomber returned riddled with holes. He had fired over 600 rounds at attacking fighters and was certain he had hit nothing. His best friend, a tail gunner in a neighboring bomber, was killed by a fighter that attacked from dead astern, the angle Romano was supposed to defend. That night, haunted and furious, Romano climbed back into the silent, oil-stinking tail of his B-17 knockout dropper. He stared at the useless ring and bead sight. The moment of inspiration was born not from complex theory, but from simple, frustrated observation. He noticed his own pale, ghostly reflection in the curved plexiglass of the tail window. In that distorted mirror, he could see angles behind the plane that his fixed sight could never show him. A thought exploded